Okay, thank you all for coming. Those of you here and online too, we're streaming this. First of all, we'd like to thank and recognize the legacy and generosity of Catherine and David Moore. Their support is why we have this terrific event, plus our relationship with the Pulitzer Center in general, which makes events like these, as well as our participation in the Pulitzer Center Reporting Fellowship possible, so we are forever grateful to them. Our pro presenter today, Camila DeChalus, is currently a congressional reporter for the Washington Post, covering key players on Capitol Hill and the most pressing issues facing the country. She also has covered national politics for other news outlets like Business Insider, CQ Roll Call, and CNN. She attended American University for her undergraduate studies, was also a 2016 Pulitzer Center Reporting Fellow herself, and we're very glad to have her with us today.
Okay. Well, I'll talk a little bit about myself, even though you gave a really great introduction there. I went to school at American University where I studied broadcast journalism and minored in Latin American studies solely because I wanted to study abroad, and that was the only minor that I could do. But I really didn't have a good sense about what I really wanted to do after school. I had only really one extracurricular activity in high school. They only had one extracurricular club, and that was journalism. And I had a teacher there where I think, everybody was kind of trying to explore what college to go to. And he kind of said, I was writing a story, and I don't even remember at the time what it was about. It was about, we had a daycare for a lot of students that had kids. And we noticed that there was some underlying problems where the kids themselves, the babies, weren't getting a lot of formula. And I wrote about that. And I remember him saying that after I wrote the story, and a lot of people, it kind of almost changed the daycare at the center. At the high school at the time, and I remember him just being like, the thing about journalism is just every day is different, and every day you're not constantly doing the same thing, and you get kind of almost paid to learn. And so I thought he was kind of kidding at that, but when I was asked, when I was applying to schools, what I would want to major in, I just automatically said journalism because that was the only thing I was really exposed to at the time that I showed a little bit of interest in. And so I went to American University, and I really was kind of learning the chops about everything from print, what it's like to really report on a deadline, and writing, to producing podcasts, to doing video elements of it. And I really loved that video element of it. I loved the editing process, and I really thought I saw myself behind the scenes. Just talking to people, coming out with a camera. I had a little show with one of my roommates at the time where we would go explore DC and show students what was around the city, really fun stuff. But when it really came to my last year, it was okay, this is crunch time. What am I really going to do? What even interest, right? Do I want to do politics, business, everything like that? I actually reached out to alum from American University. I literally went on LinkedIn and was okay, who's kind of doing something similar? And at the time, someone came to speak to my school, and they were working at CNN at the time. And so they were saying that there's a rotational program where you can basically do everything. You can be a producer and work, hand scripts to the anchors, to everything to looking at how video producers actually edit video. And so at that time, I was really kind of looking into that. But then also the Pulitzer Center came to the school and was saying, I have this class, and it was an international affairs class. And they were saying that they would pay for a grant for your choosing to go to any country and just really find a topic where you could write a story about. And so, but they were very specific. They wanted religion and climate change. And I remember researching for about a month, how could I put these two together? But I came across a group, a Catholic group, that was based in Colombia, that was because of climate change was impacting the coffee industry in Colombia. That's what Colombia was kind of known for, especially in the southern region. They started noticing that a lot of farmers, because coffee only grows once a year, that they needed to diversify their crops and really just kind of change their farms just to handle climate change and the fact that they weren't growing what they used to. So I made my pitch to go to Colombia, spend a month there, and not only write stories, but also do a video documentary about it, 5 minutes and things like that. And I really, I went on the ground. I actually went with a professor, and I spent about 3 weeks in the southern part of Colombia, right on the border of Ecuador in this region called Nariño. And I studied coffee farmers every day, the whole process of how they even harvest their coffee, to them cultivating, getting it off the vines, to them then trying to sell it, and even learning the difference between how they even try to negotiate those business deals with big companies like Starbucks, right? And that was really wide-eyed experience. But even after that, I still didn't know whether I really liked to write or whether I really liked to do videos. And so I did a CNN program for 9 months, spending time on show teams like Jake Tapper, to then also writing stories. And it was around the time that Trump was running for office, and I noticed that everybody was like on the campaign trail, out in the field, kind of reporting about him, but a lot of stories were like getting untold. And so I ended up I found an editor at the time who was having lunch, and I went up to him about 5 stories I had in my head that I really wanted to pitch that I felt like CNN wasn't covering. And I started pitching them. And we kind of built a rapport about that, and I started writing for CNN Politics. And I ended up really, like, everything from talking about how Virginia was trying to find more ways to get people that were previously incarcerated to vote again, to talking about refugees that were in the US and how people could help them. It was called like Airbnb, but for refugees. I started writing about that and kind of producing video elements to it. And after that, I just realized I wanted more experience. So I joined a tech startup. It was like more like a media startup, and started covering everything from international affairs to business. I already had that experience at CNN writing about politics, but I just wanted to see if I could write about other things. And then I joined right after CQ Roll Call, where I started covering immigration in the Department of Homeland Security. And if anybody knows, around that time in 2017, that's when Trump started implementing a lot of policies on immigration, especially at the southern border. So I spent about 3 years on Capitol Hill, but then also going to the southern border and reporting about what was actually happening. And I think the best part about that is that all the time I spent on Capitol Hill learning about policies and lawmakers and voting and everything like that, I could actually go to the southern border and say, hey, this is what the government's saying, like this is how it's supposed to be, but then actually on the ground, it was completely different. Even going to Mexico for a short stint, and the US government kept saying that, the children that were at these facilities waiting for their immigration or asylum, they're supposed to be getting education, and then actually going to these shelters and finding out that kids that were 9 or 10 years old didn't know how to read or write at all, that they weren't getting classes, and ended up writing about 6 and 7 stories about that. And so, I think all the while it's just knowing how to find stories, knowing who to interview, knowing, what is the media not covering, how can I do a better job, what stories can I tell that just need more coverage, and, what's the data that can back it up to really show that this is an existing problem. And after CQ Roll Call, I went to Business Insider for a little bit, covering more campaigns, politics, but still bringing my immigration knowledge. And then now I landed at Washington Post, where I'm covering Capitol Hill, but then also just kind of covering the issues that are happening across the country. I just came back from a trip to Ohio, where I was talking to residents in East Palestine that just happened with the trail derailment. And they were just talking about how they're still experiencing a lot of symptoms like headaches, tight chest, anxiety. I mean, a railroad just crossed and everybody just stopped and froze, just like, with a lot of anxiety, just fearing that maybe something else is going to happen. And so I think my really passion is trying to tell those stories that are not being told, but do it through a lens of like, what can Capitol Hill, what can lawmakers do about this, and what's not being done. I always say it's like I cover the intersection of politics and people, but really emphasizing on the people, but then also trying to hold the people accountable who are actually making the policies themselves. And that's a little bit about myself, not to get a little boring about it. But I think, one of the biggest things I really want to emphasize, and I was just talking to Eric about this, is that the media landscape is constantly changing. What worked for some of my mentors to get into journalism about 5-6 years ago just doesn't apply now. Actually, how I made the jump from Business Insider, where I was covering a lot of politics, but I didn't really have a beat to the Washington Post, was that I started noticing that when I was covering the January 6th hearings on Capitol Hill, like people kind of knew saw it on TV, like 30 seconds of like what was going on, but a lot of people didn't understand the behind the scenes, right? Like even when they showed the first footage of the rioters entering Capitol Hill, a lot of the police officers that were there that day were in the front rows, and a lot of their family members were, especially officers who were injured during that time, and they were visually like crying while this footage was happening. And so I ended up just taking out my phone, and this was not because my editors told me at all, but then asking them right after the footage was played and when we had a break, which, again, it's not really covered, it's not like a part of the story, but I remember asking them, what was your first reaction to this? And I started kind of taking videos like that, just kind of creating more transparency of what people weren't seeing behind the scenes. And I started posting that on my social media platforms, and just a way where when you see my article, you can also kind of see the interviews, my video interviews while I'm having as well. And actually the Washington Post started noticing that at the time, and they started getting a lot of attention. A lot of people started kind of following me on different social media platforms. And when I kind of was poached by the Washington Post, they were essentially saying, hey, we see what you're doing with like video. It was almost like trying to combine my passion of, I really like writing, but I wanted to kind of do video too, and saying, hey, we want you to do this as well. Kind of, we know right now, the media landscape, people are not just consuming their news by going on the Washington Post and seeing what's happening. A lot of people get their news from going on social media. So if it's like you can meet people where they're at, these videos, almost like when you're showing them a glimpse, they're then going to kind of read your stories and try to get a little bit of understanding of what's happening. So I really suggest anybody that's interested in going to journalism is just knowing more than one skill. You know, writing is great, but the fact that I know how to video edit on the fly with phone apps or on Adobe Premiere, the fact that, you know, I have different skills where I can play to, where I don't have to rely on another person. Now I have a team where I have an editor, I have a producer, I have a supervisor that can kind of help me make those decisions. But before it was just me, myself, and I was just doing that on the fly and just posting that up. So I really do think that learning different skills and not just only being set to do, you know, writing or do audio journalism, they're great forms. I always say if you have a great story, you can find 10 different platforms to tell them on. There's a lot of times where I get audio, maybe they don't make it into my videos I post online, but then they make it into a podcast where I partner up with someone. So it's just really great to kind of have different skills under my belt, and I almost think it's the best thing that I didn't just choose a vertical and choose a subject just to cover that. I kind of had that experience to do a kind of bit of everything. In a way, I had my hand in different things.
Do you have a video or something we could, like a sample of your
Oh,
work?
yeah.
Show it for you?
So, okay. So this was an example. I'll show the article first. So as you can see, this was an article. So they wanted, does everybody know who George Santos is? Raise of hands. If not.
Does George Santos know who George Santos is? I don't know.
Right, he goes by a lot of names. Anthony DeVolder. I mean, I've gotten crazy calls being like, wait, I thought his name was like something else. Like people just saying like, I knew him back then. So everybody was covering who this person was. He was on Capitol Hill. I tell you, every time I go near him, he now runs really straight through because he knows I'm going to ask him questions. And at the time, there's like 20 reporters posted outside of his office. He started like even bringing Dunkin' Donuts to the point that that's how big like the press like attention was to him. But I think the thing when I was talking to my editor about this story was that I heard everything about on Capitol Hill what people were saying, even lawmakers that were like, I refuse to work with him, right? Like nothing's going to get done. But a lot of I felt at the time wasn't really being said about the residents that are actually being represented by him. You know, like with all the light of at that point, every news story was coming out. Like every day there was a new development, right? And we know on Capitol Hill he was kind of like a pariah. Nobody wanted to touch him. Nobody wanted to even talk about him. But then, you know, the thing I kept hearing was like, he's not going to be effective representative to the constituents. Like at the end of the day, the constituents are the ones that like really feel the brunt of this. But then I felt like I was looking online and I saw no stories even talking to some of the constituents there. So what I pitched was to go to his district, which is a part of Long Island, and talk to residents there. And it ended up, I talked to like 12 just on the street. I mean, really standing by train stations like, hey, my name is Camila, sorry, like, you know, like kind of approaching off the fly, or standing in coffee shops kind of waiting if I saw someone by themselves. You know, slyly starting conversation. My best advice is just don't go up and automatically be like, I'm a reporter, because we already know that there's a lot of connotations. A lot of people already have their own thoughts about me. It was really started with a general conversation of, you know, what are you doing? Or, oh, I noticed you're reading a book there. And then it started asking me about this. And I actually got led to, someone was like, hey, I'm having a meeting in my basement. Like, it's all these like Republican residents in this area that want to talk about him. And at first I was like, oh, okay, you know, I'm not really from this area. Is this worth it? But it turned out it was in this American Legion office facility. And that night, like, it wouldn't have happened if I didn't talk to at least 20 people. And there was, out of the 20 people, there was like definitely like 60 rejections there, right? But the 20 people that did want to talk, they recommended me to go to this meeting and to talk to Republicans who did vote for him and how they felt about it at their time. So this was a great representation of, I wrote a whole story about, you know, what they were saying at this town hall, not even a town hall, this like unofficial meeting, right? But then I also made a video element because a lot of people, while I'm asking to interview them, I asked also like, hey, can I also record this on my phone? And everybody said yes. So then I posted it. If you want to go to the second link up there.
Go up.
Yes, it's the second window tab if you see it.
The what?
The second window tab.
Oh, the second window tab.
Yes.
Got it. Right
And
here?
so I started, and this is like, again, just a quick, a minute and 10 seconds video of where, again, I was talking to people, and I just wanted to show the general public what people in his hometown were actually saying about him. So
Give it a roll.
I recently spoke with New York residents who voted for Republican Representative George Santos.
Thanks.
and asked them if they have any regret. I recently spoke with New York residents who voted for Republican Representative George Santos and asked them if they have any regrets.
Every day that he is still there, we are suffering. I mean, he's become a joke on late night talk shows, but to us it's not funny because we deserve a real congressman.
The damage is already done. So he already stated that he wasn't going to resign. He's going to see this play out. And then now it's the responsibility of Congress, where he is now, to do what they want with him.
What happens if all this information never came out? We would never know, right? How many other members of Congress have secrets in their closet that we don't know about either? We need him because he's a conservative Republican, and if he gets kicked out of office, then what? We have to have a special election, and then we don't know. We know what we got. He voted with McCarthy all along when they were trying to get him for the Speaker of the House. We know that he's going to vote conservative.
Just disappointing. And as far as giving up a seat, it's to be seen, and it's sad.
I recently spoke with New York residents who voted for
And I just want to say that I think there was a general assumption in DC that everybody was going to say the same thing in his home district. Like everybody was going to be like, oh wow, he's despicable, right? But then clearly in the video, it's like there was actually some people that were like, no, we'd rather have him than a Democrat in office. Like we'd rather have someone that we know is going to vote along party lines. And I think that was just an interesting perspective because a lot of times in DC, like journalists, we kind of talk to each other saying, oh, we already know what the story is going to be, right? But a lot of what I try to do is kind of bring in different voices or say, okay, I know what we think, but like, what are the people on the ground actually saying? And I think combining the policy of like, combining what's on Capitol Hill, but then to actually what's on the ground and what people are saying, because at the end of the day, these are the constituents that like, it's their needs that need to be represented in Congress. And if they feel comfortable with him being in office, then that's maybe something that we need to show as well. So it's just understanding that, you know, in this story, I really try to show the complexity of this issue, that it's not just really black and white, or that not just one community in this district thinks the same way, right? A lot of times when I'm covering a lot of congressional races in different countries, and there's always this assumption that, oh, everybody thinks this way, or, you know, this candidate is one way, and you really want to show just not, if I talk to 10 supporters of George Santos, I want to also talk to 10 people that don't support him, right? Because the whole goal is to show both sides and show a complexity of the issue, not just what one group and one person is thinking. And a lot of times when I'm even in Ohio, if I meet 5 people that say, hey, there's no problem here, I'm going to try to talk to at least 60, 70 people to try to understand the view. And a lot of times when I approach people, I just say, I just really want to just 10 seconds of your time just because I'm not from here and I want to just have a better understanding of what's actually going on and what you're thinking on the ground right now. And a lot of times people are really receptive of that because they don't think that media is really showing them their perspective, or they don't see themselves in some of the stories that they read. And even that goes for me covering, like if I'm talking to a lot of males, I try to talk to a lot of females. If I talk to like, you know, a lot of people of color, I try to, you know, try to show a mix of the gamut there, because it's really, even I have to ask the question, do you usually vote Democrat or Republican? Because that also informs your decision. So really trying to show the complexity in different people's perspective is really key. If I know I'm interviewing, or I just notice in the span of 20 minutes of interviewing people that I've only skewed towards a lot of young people, I'm going to try to reach out and go to a lot of people that skew a little older. I noticed that going to movie theaters during the daytime, I can always find a certain demographic there, right? Like, it's kind of things like that that I started kind of program of like, okay, I've interviewed 60 people. What were the demographics here? Did they show a difference in opinion? If not, maybe that means I need to spend another day on the ground just to get a fuller picture, because I do not feel comfortable writing a story if I feel like I only have one side of the story to be told. If that makes sense. Yeah. So again, so these are just some interviews like I do, but a lot of the times it is as simple as if I know I'm, have you guys heard of the transcription service Otter? It's a recording service. It lets you kind of record in real time and also transcribe it. But a lot of times if I know I have someone's permission to do that, I also ask, can I do a video recording of it? And that way, it's also showing the video element of it. You know, even for when I know I'm going to do a podcast for the Washington Post, I also try to make sure, you know, I have certain technology to make the audio clear. But a lot of times, like, these interviews are on the fly and they're in really crowded places. And sometimes people are really shy, or I have to ask them, like, you see only 30 seconds, but sometimes that interview is about 10, 15 minutes long. I also noticed that putting your phone out and just saying, hey, talk, that's very jarring to people. It's not natural. So sometimes I like to cross my arms and just talk to them, right? Like ask them like it's a conversation. I think the more someone feels comfortable, the more they're really going to open up. I've had interviews of where the moment, I take the camera out their face, that's when they're like, okay, this is what I really think. It's just making someone feel comfortable. And I think since I've been doing this for now 7 to 8 years, I've just gotten better at talking to people, kind of gauging whether they're really tense, gauging whether they feel a little defensive or they already think I'm going to kind of attack their opinions. I was just in Oregon covering one of the governor's races there, and a lot of the topics was about crime and homelessness and education. That was a really big one, and critical race theory came up, and I remember this woman, we were talking and she was like, do you think I'm your oppressor? Do you think I'm like, you're being oppressed even by this conversation? And, just clearly I think it was really trying to be well-meaning, but she was just trying to get across that she really doesn't like this education system. And it was like, okay, but it's like, is that your biggest concern? Is that why you're voting for a certain Republican? Or, what do you think their beliefs are? What have you known about their policy stances, right? And again, sometimes you're not going to get the perfect interview in a minute or 2 minutes. Sometimes the conversation has to last for 30, but it's just knowing how long you can be there and how long you can just give someone to really talk. And sometimes you just notice that people really want to vent. I was just in East Palestine, and someone was really just frustrated that they were not seeking the medical care that they really needed, that their daughters had a lot of rashes that they were just kind of being passed off saying, oh, it just could be attributed to new clothes. But they were like, no, that only occurred after the train derailment happened and I started experiencing headaches and all these things like that. And for the interview lasted for about 30 minutes. And it was just mostly like he just felt like he wasn't being heard, that the only time that people really wanted to ask him his thoughts was just when they were coming for a news story. But the moment that the news cameras leave, then he feels like the senators or the people that were supposed to be representing his town, they just kind of were ignoring him. So, these are kind of important conversations to have, and just kind of getting their thoughts of what's really happening, and are they even satisfied with some of the resources that they're getting, or do they think it's inadequate at that time? And so really understanding those stories, and I always recommend, especially if you're kind of dropping in and parachuting into a place, always get people's contact information. You never know when you have any follow-up questions, and those people can also be sources for stories in the future, right? Every resident, every person I talk to, I always try to get their contact information, email, phone numbers, because again, I did a story in Oregon and 5 months ago, but I'm now going to write another one, and these are the same people I can now call and say, hey, I know you're there. Can you give me a more perspective on what's actually happening, right? So it's really to say anybody, striking conversations with anybody anywhere from a certain area, from different areas, can always really inform your reporting.
You obviously have such a huge TikTok presence for the Washington Post. Are there a lot of reporters like you who do this, or is this sort of your niche?
Yeah, so this is something they created specifically having me on board, and they have another reporter that does the campaign style of it, but it's really the whole thought process, and it honestly, I was giving the example of Queen Elizabeth dying. I asked a bunch of 6 friends around me, and I said, how did you find the news about that? And they all said through Instagram, through Twitter, through TikTok. It's kind of understanding when I was talking about the change of landscape, knowing that a lot of people are just not consuming their news by just going on the internet and going on CNN or Fox News or what have you, whatever media platform, just to see what's happening. A lot of people are digesting their news on a social media presence, and so I was created with another, I was brought on with the Washington Post with another reporter, and it's really to show, okay, while you're doing the reporting, talking to the people, can you also get a video element of it? When you're covering this congressional hearing, like tomorrow, the TikTok CEO is supposed to testify for the first time ever in front of Congress, and they're thinking about a nationwide ban, right? My kind of thought process of the whole thing is what are people in the room saying? What are their reactions? What is the line going to be like? What's a visual element that I can show that can kind of give people behind the scenes that if you're not in the room in DC, what can you not see? And so I kind of approach it to the lens of saying, if I'm interviewing 60 people, do 5 or 10 of them want to go on video and kind of talk about their opinions as well? If I'm in a hearing room and I know people can stream that on C-SPAN or whatever, what's something that they can't see, or what are reactions, maybe even after the person testifies, maybe it's me talking to a lawmaker, grabbing them in the hallway, which people really don't see, me in the staircases, running, sprinting, and talking to them and saying, were you satisfied with that response? Do you think that you do want to ban TikTok or maybe any other app that you find that is poses as a national security threat? And so I think I've talked to several outlets that they want to kind of do the same thing, because the whole traditional of carrying a huge camera and running down the halls, now we kind of have, our phones that sometimes is as, like, I remember I recorded one video, and someone was like, what camera did you use? And I really was like, oh, no, it's an iPhone 14. Like, I just, they're just going to give me a new iPhone every time it comes out because the quality has gotten so much better. So I really do think that the less you can carry sometimes is the better, right? Like, it's a little bit more accessible. And a lot of like news outlets I do know, they even some TV outlets, they want to kind of start doing the same thing just because it's a little bit more approachable, people feel a little bit more comfortable, and people want their news a little bit faster. So it's like if I can show a behind the scenes of something that I know is happening in real time, then it's a little bit more engaging. And of course that 60-second video is not going to inform you, right? Like, I hope you don't think this one video is going to like have you thinking, okay, you know everything about George Santos and what residents in his house, in his district think, but maybe I include a link at the end, and if you're so enticed, then you will go back and actually read a full story to get the fuller context there.
How long does it take you on average, do you think, to do one of your TikTok videos? Like the beginning, like the editing process? Is it
Oh,
quick, right?
yeah, that takes like 5-10 minutes for me. But I think college really did help Adobe Premiere, and I downloaded, it's a CapCut, and there's like different apps that like kind of help you do it faster, and so like even for this, I was down there for 2 days. I stood outside in the cold. It was like 10 degrees, and I was like at every change. Like I really was like, where do a lot of people stand around? Because when people are standing around, they're less unlikely to kind of decline you because they have nothing better to do than wait for the train. And so I kind of try to pick those areas, and the more I got, people were like, oh, go to this pier, and like a lot of people do their jogs and their walks, and so I sure enough went there, and was just waiting around and talking to people. So I think the interviews themselves kind of last like 2 days, but then when I actually have the interviews, and sometimes when you're talking to someone, like I can be talking to you, and the moment you say something where I'm like, wow, that was powerful, or that's good, I already know in my head that that's a 30-second clip that I can just post. And if it's so powerful, like at the Supreme Court, there was a lot of student debt protests that happened about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I talked to a woman who said she was like more than $125,000 in student debt, and how it was like really causing her shame, and to the point that she felt like almost suicidal at one point, and then she now started feeling like more energized that she was in this crowd of hundreds of people, and they were all trying to ask for the same thing. I remember just posting her clip, like I interviewed 20, 30 people, but I just felt like her story was just really powerful to just talk about student debt, this issue that's become almost political in a sense, like has really personal impacts on people's lives, and posting her clip, that just took about 30 seconds. And we had a story element to it as well, but it was just one of those things where it's like, sometimes it's a montage of different video interviews, and sometimes it's one, maybe it's like me recapping something that I've seen in first-hand view, and I just really want to talk about it. So it's different depending on what the video format is, but these are always the easiest because it's like when I'm talking to someone, I already know what I want to kind of clip.
Is there a vetting process? Do you have an editor who looks at them first, or are you just
Yes, so we actually, some of the videos too, we post on the Washington Post Instagram, which has like 6 million, they have like about 10 different social media presence platforms, and like Instagram, they have a TikTok as well. And so what they like to do too, I think it's just making sure we have their contact information, their first name, their last name. I love to ask like if they're any protests, are they actually even from DC? Because a lot of times, like one of the women I talked to, she was from Texas, right? And she traveled all the way there. So just getting their actual information, and if they're gonna post it to their actual platforms, then we have someone vet it. But it's very much like, okay, do we have actually their full description, who they are, and everything like that. So there is a bit of a vetting just to make sure, even they put text on screen just to make sure that's correct and everything like that.
Do you prefer, or are they so different you can't really compare it, like a long form video and a short TikTok? You prefer one or the other, or are they just so different it doesn't?
No, that's a great question. So at the Washington Post, we also do, we have a producer, and if they're long form where we're actually really explaining out an issue, something that's going on that's a little bit more complex than saying it in 60 seconds or just showing someone's opinion, we actually have to script it out. So, when I'm talking on video, it almost seems like I'm speaking naturally, but it's actually like, no, 5 people looked at that. We had to vet every single word we use, especially when it comes to really complex issues, or just trying to break down something that happened, but we really want to make sure we're as informed as possible to communicate it. So the process itself to write a script, like when it's a long form, when it's like 2 or 3 minutes, it takes about like 2 to 3 hours at most, and to do a video like that. Yeah, I could show you an example.
You do?
Yeah, I can show you.
Where can I find it?
Yeah, should I answer Q&As? Well,
Of
Sure.
course.
Yeah, it's actually really funny because throughout the videos I've experimented with different ones. So I bought it in Oregon. It's this one that clips that's almost like a lava mic, but it clips directly into iPhone. And that was actually after this that it picks up like the best quality that I've ever had. And then I've started experimenting with wireless mics. We got one from DJI. I don't know if that's, and it's pretty expensive, but it's like all wireless and it almost acts like it's attached to a bigger camera. So it's actually been a lot of trial and error because I think a lot of microphones nowadays, or really, really like good ones, are like really made for like the Nikon, the Canon, like bigger cameras, right? Like the really studio quality cameras. And not a lot of them are actually made for iPhones. I think in this like day and age of like vlogging, it's like, and you know, it's gotten like bigger and they've gotten better. But I just actually bought one that's been really good. It's just like taking you to set up sometimes, especially because I'm on the fly interviewing people. It's just like something that I still haven't programmed my like had to think about a lot of times. But there's ones I just honestly just plug it in. I think I even have one in my jacket, to be honest with you. I have like different ones, seriously, like because the whole idea sometimes too is like if one doesn't work, you need to like be very quick on your feet and make sure that you're plugging in and finding another one. So I actually have like 4 or 5 different with me if you ever want to see it afterwards. But they've ended up being really good use of it. I think in the beginning it was very much like, oh no, it's fine. And then I started noticing, especially when I'm in crowded settings, like, no, the iPhone just only having this is not going to work at all. And so it's been a lot of like trial and error. And there's been some where I'm like, oh, that was a miss. That didn't pick up any audio quality at all. We're just going to use a shot and say, you know, this is what I did, but we're not going to, like, it's just too, like I've had a video where people are like, show the tape. And I'm like, no, you don't want to show the tape. Like you could not even hear him. There's just no way. Like it's just inaudible. Like you can't even see that he's like even speaking. So it's been a lot of trial and error, I will say. But I think when you find like a really good
This Democratic law.
and knowing what situations you're in too can also help. Yes, I think that's been my go-to, especially when I'm doing one-on-one conversations. But there's a lot of times when I'm in a group and 5 people want to talk and one lavalier is not going to capture someone on the right or left. So I've actually been experimenting with one I can just clip onto people, not even have to like attach and like do the whole like, oh, can I see your tie or see your collar? And that's been a little bit better, just doing that. I can also show you, I can
Yeah.
show up and show
Okay,
you.
sure.
The one that's been like
This one's live too.
a little bit more scripted, so you can kind of see where it doesn't even seem like I talked for a lot of time, but then it ended up being it was like 6 hours. And he used me while I say
It's interesting to see how headlines have sort of evolved on headlines on TikTok. I see you have headlines
yeah.
on your TikTok videos, which I think
Wow.
is probably really useful, right?
Yeah, they are. I think it's just like kind of giving someone to like let them know what's actually happening, and then exactly, kind of like showing them foresight. Like I did one on a TikTok ban that we're having that everybody was talking about. Oh, like you know what's happening, but not a lot of people know what's happening. Can you kind of try to describe it? And that was one where we thought that was going to be very simple, and it ended up being very complex. I'm trying to like find it now. It's like one of those things when you need to find it, you're like, you can't find it. And then, oh yes, this was one. Okay. So a funny story about this was that I randomly was waiting for votes. So what happens, a lot of lawmakers descend upon these stairs, and that's a great time where you can take out your phone and kind of start talking to people. So I randomly saw a guy, his name is Mike Gallagher, he's not a guy. He's a representative, and he just introduced a bill to ban TikTok. And so we got this clip, it was about 40 seconds, but then I had a producer at the time, and they're like, we should make a full-on video about this. And the video itself is only 48 seconds, but the script, like the whole process from finish to end, it took us about 5 hours to like really script this out and make sure we get it right.
They wouldn't be able to download it. They wouldn't be able to use the app.
That's Republican Representative Mike Gallagher, who just introduced a bill to officially ban TikTok in the U.S.
It's digital fentanyl in the sense that it's highly addictive.
The bill aims to block all transactions from TikTok in the United States. It would also place a ban on other social media companies that are based in China, Russia, and other countries of concern. And Republicans aren't alone in this effort. The bill was introduced with Democratic Representative Raja Krishnamurthy and Republican Senator Marco Rubio, who says that there are national security concerns with this app.
They allow the Chinese Communist Party to gain access to all of the private data on any device in America that's using TikTok.
This bill isn't the first of its kind to place limits on TikTok. States with Republican governors like South Dakota, Utah, and Maryland have already restricted the app on state-owned government devices.
They wouldn't be able to download it.
So I think that was just an example of something where I caught him outside. He was giving an interview about why he's even doing this in the first place. And then just even in that audio clip of like him even talking about why he's doing it, I just felt like there wasn't a lot of context for people to really understand that this is a bigger deal, that this is not just happening in Capitol Hill, but this is happening across the U.S. And then now, just given that the CEO is actually testifying and there's actually like more concerns that it's going to be banned, it just now people can kind of understand a little bit more context of what's happening and why it is.
So you'll be there tomorrow, I think.
Yes, if everything with Trump and him potentially be arrested doesn't keep me in New York City for another day and a half.
Right.
Yeah.
So, thinking about tomorrow, if you're already at Capitol Hill and watch the TikTok CEO testify, you talked about it a little bit already, but what's your game plan? You go in and you kind of see what, I like your thing, that you want to get what's not happening in front of the camera already. So how would you sort of scope out your story hypothetically tomorrow? What would you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of times if there's a really, really big hearing that's happening, they try to do a background call where they kind of give reporters just an inside glimpse of what's going to take place. So how long he's expected to speak, what are some of the concerns that they have that we're almost positive that they're actually going to bring up at the hearing. And so a lot of times they have a table where reporters can actually sit and they give you a better view of the person that's testifying and like the lawmakers, and also when they leave, it's also a chance for you to grab them as well. But it's one of those things that, since I know it's happening at 10 o'clock, it's better I get there at 9 o'clock. I usually like kind of to stake out, see who's actually coming. Sometimes celebrities come, sometimes members of the public. Sometimes there's protests, depending on how big or controversial the issue is. So it's like those are some things to spot out. What's standing out? What's kind of rare? What's something that people wouldn't be expecting that's going to happen here? And then I think the biggest part is like listening to what he's saying, and then also seeing the lawmakers' reactions to seeing if they're like buying what's happening, or they're, maybe have more questions, especially if he gets tied up and maybe you see that he's hesitating or he didn't say something, or maybe it's also kind of understanding, since this is his first time he's speaking, usually whenever someone's testifying, I like to look back and see what other interviews they've had, what things they've said in the past, but because there's no context to kind of play off of, it's a little bit harder in the scenario. So a lot of this is really just going to see what the person says, how they are reacting, whether they're satisfied with the answers, and just even some of the, in the peripheral, protests that may be going on, people standing outside, what's actually happening in the environment to kind of put more of the stakes at high.
Seeing as TikTok is kind of your bread and butter, how do you stay objective?
Yeah, no, it's funny because I think a lot of people have a lot of, even when I posted the video, a lot of people were like, wait, TikTok, of course not, like this can't happen. I think for me, because I use other social media platforms as well, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, if it does go under, it's nice that I've also built other followings in other places where I can still, I think my whole objective is just to put more videos out there that can just kind of peel back the layers of my reporting, and so if I'm able to do that in other platforms, then that works as well.
When you say peel back the layers, and I know you post videos about the stories you're covering, do you feel like that's what people want today? They want to know what's going on behind the camera and what's going on in your mind?
I think it's just to get a sense of the transparency of the interviews and what I'm saying, because a lot of times I even talked to someone that were like, I talked to you for 10 minutes, but you're just going to put 30 seconds in your story, or put a sentence in your story and that's it, right? And I think for somebody, I've gotten a question once, can I see the full interview? And that's something easy where if I have the full interview, I will just post it. So I think it's creating that transparency, and I think that a lot of times people do really have questions about what it's like to be a reporter or what was it like on the ground. And if I can just kind of provide a glimpse of that and kind of showcase that, then it's almost adding to my reporting. It's not really taking away from it. A lot of times I get that question, how can you do both? But if I'm doing it in real time, it's just a matter of me taking out my phone and recording it. And it's almost even better if I have someone with me, so I don't have to even think about that sometimes.
By the way, your flash is
Oh
lights.
yeah, I've been noticing that. Let me take that off.
My bad again. Anyone have any questions?
You mentioned people asking to see the full transcript. Have you ever had it happen where you've shown it to somebody and they've requested you not publish it?
Oh, full transcript of like a random person being like, oh, can you show the full video? Or you're saying the person I'm interviewing themselves and they're saying, hey, can you not?
Like you mentioned someone asking to see it, so that, because you're using like a clip of what they said, not the whole thing, and they asked to see the full thing. Have you ever had that happen where they're asking, oh, don't publish that?
Oh, there's been times where I've recorded and then they said, hey, actually, I'm not comfortable. And I think for me, it's like I have to respect that. Like definitely, especially if they agreed to go on record and by just saying, oh, yes, like let's interview, whatever you say you can use, but then at the end they say, hey, actually, I don't want to use that, then I typically just don't use that. A lot of times if I play like 10 seconds and I know, because the video can only be 2 minutes long, that I can only play a short, I get questions like, hey, can you play the full thing? And especially since I already have permission from someone, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, I'll just post the whole thing. But there's been times where after interview, this is not even on the video, but it could be just me recording, that then they say, actually, I'm not comfortable. Maybe what I said was too personal or it's too sensitive, and I actually don't want my name even associated with that. And then that's where I kind of go, I say, okay, I'm not gonna use the video, but do you want me not just to include your name? Like, what is the concern there? And I try to work with them. But if it's completely like, nope, scratch that, nothing I want to be said to go on, then I just don't use it.
Is that usually, quote unquote, normal people, regular people who say that, or do you find that it's people in the public eye who say that too?
Oh, yes. Lawmakers say that all the time. There's been times where, like, I've asked about a certain bill that they've introduced, meaning, like, they're the ones that putting out there saying, attaching their names to it, and they don't even know what's in it sometimes. And they're just like, wait, actually, talk to my press person. Don't, like, can you, like, not use that? And then I think in those situations, if the story's not even about that, then it's fine. And others, maybe that is going to be a line we include. I think it's just depending on the situation. I often find it's times where they might say something that could be potentially controversial, or maybe not everybody will agree with their opinion, that they then feel a little shy away to say, hey, actually, can you not publish this? But very rarely do I listen to lawmakers when they say that, because I do think that that's their job to know that. Yeah, so I don't have that much sympathy for that. Yes.
These days, people get majority of their news from social media, and I see that a lot of times what makes or breaks an article, people are scrolling through their timelines, so the thumbnail as well as the title, and that's just the start. Then when they get to reading the article, then in terms of the attention span and all that. So I want to ask you, what type of writing techniques do you use from the writing the article to the title itself? What type of writing techniques do you use to keep people engaged and informed and wanting to read the full article?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. A lot of times, I've been saying kind of throughout me talking that I'll interview maybe 10 to 20 people for a particular story. And I think there's sometimes your mind as a reporter, because I just did all that work for 10 hours, I'm going to include every single quote or everything that was told to me. And I really want to caution you guys against doing that. I think sometimes our pride as a journalist is like, I want to show you exactly, this story should have been 4,000 words. But I don't even have the attention span to read 4,000 words. You know what I mean? So a lot of times it's really sitting down either with myself or with an editor or even just someone, right? Because I find the best people I can bounce ideas off of, people that are not in journalism whatsoever, just literally living their lives to be like, what is interesting about this? And a lot of times when I look back, I always do this after every reporting trip or every day, I look back at my interviews and say, what stood out? What's something that I should lead with? And it's, what I've kind of noticed is that scenarios where it might seem that unexpected or surprising, I often lead with that. So people don't even know for this story, I set out, like I was saying, train stations, coffee shops, everywhere, right, to talk to people. But the most startling thing that I felt like really showcased the complexity of the issues of how voters had mixed reactions to George Santos even being in office was at this informal basement meeting that spanned an hour. There was Christ Jesus band playing upstairs. It was very informal. And I kind of wrote that out. That was my lead. That was in this bottom basement, in in this where there's a church Christ band playing, people are meeting to talk about one thing, George Santos. And I in my head, in real moment, was like, okay, I spent 3 days, that was exhausting, but this is what I want to lead with, because I think out of all my reporting, this is what is going to get people to read. And it's also being cognizant of that, right? Like, we don't have the longest attention span, so I'm not going to put in the parts that I think are interesting. I'm going to put in the parts where I just feel like really show the complexity of the issue and the really strong quotes, the quotes that really, I'm even surprised by. So I think that's kind of where, and there's times where my editor and I go back and forth and we're like, can I keep this? And she's like, no, cut it out. And I think it just makes you better for it. But a lot of those interviews that I made as videos, they weren't actually even in the story. So it's also I think a part of me, maybe that's why I started making videos, because I was like, wait, those are such good interviews, but I can't put every single one in. So, there's a video element if you want to see more of those.
You mentioned working with your editor on what they want to cut. What do you do in the situation where they want to cut something, but you think it's really a really strong detail of the story that you need to keep? How do you work through that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, only because I think sometimes when you are, I always tell people this, your editor is supposed to be the bird eye view they're supposed to be a little bit more objective to your reporting, but you were there in person reporting on it, so you're going to have a different take. And I think, especially depending on the detail, it's also understanding you're defending it as well. So I've had the privilege of having really great editors where it's just a conversation, right? Maybe they cut something out, I don't agree with that. I then am almost like an attorney, this is why we should keep it, and these are my 3 points, or, hey, I've been covering this for 3 years. This is important. This is a detail that we need. Context is everything. Or, you can't understand the full picture without understanding something that took place 3 years ago. And so, usually it's always an open conversation. I've rarely had butting heads, only because I think people approach it maybe too emotional. Maybe that's the thing, where you get so much well, I was there for 50 hours, so you can't tell me I should include this, rather than being a little bit more objective. And maybe that's because my dad is an attorney, where it's actually, this is why, and I lay out the 3 reasons. So I think of being a little bit more pragmatic about it, if that makes sense, of just being hey, this is why we're including this detail, and this is why this is important. I think readers should really understand this before we even talk about it. I've rarely, I don't want to be I rarely lost that conversation, but I've rarely gotten into a position where I didn't feel comfortable with whatever I actually put out.
What were the 3 details you said that you should negotiate with the editor? You said something about 3 details.
Oh, it's more so if I'm talking about, I'll just give you an example. I went to the border, and I was talking about an immigration policy, and there was a lot of context there, and I felt like it might have been a disservice to the readers if they didn't understand what Trump did maybe 3 years ago. And so with that, it was they cut that out, but then I was actually, we need this because it doesn't make sense, and it was just listing out 3 reasons why to keep something. If the first one doesn't work, maybe the second one doesn't work, maybe the third try. I think a lot of times if they know you're adamant about something and you share a certain perspective, yeah. I always say you want to be comfortable with whatever has your name on it, and yeah. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, your editor's name or the person you were talking about, the title. There's a specific person at the Washington Post that does the SEO, and even the smaller details that the sentence, both Democrats and Republicans, there's someone that writes that, and at the end of the day, their just names are not on it. So it's really being I think I'm a little bit careful before anything gets published under my name. I have to check it 3-4 times. I know when it's scheduled. I'm the first person to read it when it gets out, because at the end of the day, my name, wherever company I might go to next, that byline is still sticking with me. So I just always want to be comfortable with what I put my name on.
You get a lot of face time with your TikToks. I know you show up on CNN and things like this, clips like that. What's that like to be on camera so much?
I think it's just a different medium, if that makes sense. I know a lot of journalists that they're I'm never doing TV. I'm only print, because it's almost you don't have to have a camera in your face. You can just interview people. I was just in Ohio, and it was all these camera people and all these reporters, on-air reporters, and I'm just in the background talking to these residents that are slyly trying to go in the clinic, and I was the one getting these interviews, because it just means a little bit more jarring. I show up, I can have a turtleneck sweater on. It doesn't, my appearance doesn't. But then I think when I'm going on TV, where it's a little bit more formal setting, my best thing I always try to say is how can I translate what's on the ground to what's happening now and how can I say it on the camera. Like, I have 3,000 words to say it in a story, but on TV, you get 20 seconds, not even. And you have to be very careful about the words that you use, even how you're conveying a story. So that's been a little bit helpful because I had a broadcast journalism background in college, and I always tell people I never did an on-air news TV job, but because I took some classes in broadcast journalism, like, I know how to stand, I know how to present myself. I'm a very fast speaker, if you can't tell, so I know before my TV hits, I cannot drink coffee at all. No, I've gotten that told. That was like the best advice I've ever got to mentor, like, Camille, you cannot drink coffee. Like, and I'm like, oh, no. Yeah, you can't. One time, this is embarrassing to say, my mom is like my biggest, like, moms can tell you things that other people just would never tell you. And I remember my first TV hits, I also talked with my hands a lot. I've actually calmed down a lot. Like, I used to be and at one time she was like, hey, do you like have tape? And I was like, oh, like, no, that's so random. She's like, can you please like tape your hands next time? Like, so I think it's, what I always tell people, if you're going to go on TV, no matter what outlet, doesn't matter, C-SPAN to like local news to national news, just practice beforehand, like stare in a mirror, very calm, hands down, even your like facial expressions, just like for 30 seconds, if I had to ask you a question about what your reporting is, can you say it in less than 30 seconds? And so I always say, like, have some bullet points. Like, in my head, I always know some bullet points I'm going to say, but just don't script it. And then when you get comfortable with that, it goes so much easier. So it's a lot of practice. It is practice. It's never you're going to get the best your first time. Because my first few TV hits were like, I was like, I'm going to stick to print. I'm not going to do this anymore. But it definitely gets easier.
Sure. There's a lot of pressure because the world we live in today, things never die. Things get passed around and go viral, and you don't always want that in your life. So you got to be prepared, right?
Yeah.
You got to be off the cuff but prepared at the same time. That's a tough balance.
Yeah.
What are the questions what you have? Let's go.
Do you have any advice for in interviews when not you but your subject is clamming up in front of the camera? How to get it to loosen up and get it together?
Yeah, I always tell people, start it off like, how I even started off, oh, what happened to your arm, right? Like, I mean, being very observational, right? Even if I see, like, maybe something you're reading, I see a book or something, I always start off the interview. If it's on the fly, I have to, like, be very more straightforward. But if it's a sit-down conversation, I always kind of ask, oh, what else? How's your day going? They may say something. I'm, like, riffing off of that for, like, 10 minutes, and then it kind of gets a little bit more comfortable. Now you feel like I'm sitting down and I'm talking to a friend. Okay, yeah, I forgot why I'm here. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? Like, I heard, especially when you were treating this very, no matter what the topic is. Like, for example, when I was in East Passing, only because it's just right in my head, I was shyly, while all the on-camera people were chasing after all these, like, medical professionals to tell them their opinions of what's happening, I stood by the clinic door to watch patients from the actual, like, town go in. And right before I stopped this woman, and I was like, hi, I'm so sorry I stopped you really quick. I'm not from here, I'm actually from DC. I'm writing this story. I actually have to go to a town that's an hour away. But I really just wanted to get a better understanding of what residents in this area really think now, a month and a half after the train derailment. And I know I only have 5 minutes, but if you can only spare 20 seconds, I would just love to just hear what you have to say. And and that was something where I could tell she was like, whoa. And then she's like, well, I have asthma right now. Like, I have these sinuses. I've had to go to the hospital 4 times in, like, the last week because, and, like, really kind of just started opening up. And it was just one of those things where I think it's, like, you start maybe too, straightforward sometimes. If you have to because of time constraint, people understand. And me explaining where I'm from, how long I think it's just creating a little bit more transparency. But especially when you have these sit-down interviews, you can take your time. I always say you never want to start off your first question being about what the story is. You start off, like, there's 10 other things going on, like, oh, did you see this happening in the news? Or, or even something random about my dog, right? Like, I always know talking about my dog sets people at ease. They're like, what's her name? And then we're just talking about that. So I think it's always, if you see them uncomfortable, it's because they already know that this is it's an interview, and they just, like, want to feel a little bit more like this is a conversation rather than an interrogation, if that makes sense.
What do you do when it's the kind of opposite situation? I mean, I interviewed a student one time about something very simple, and it ended up being a 2.5-hour recording. How do you, and it would have gone longer if I had somehow gotten him to slow down and step back. How do you handle it when it's the opposite situation and they just don't want to be quiet?
No, that happens a lot. And I think, especially, I think when you guys were asking me, like, how has the pandemic changed my reporting? I noticed in the pandemic, a lot of people, when I would call them just to get like a 2-minute quote, it would be like, hey, can we talk on the phone for 40 minutes? Like, just, I think there was maybe a lot of loneliness, right? Like a lot of like wanting a human connection. And even the aftermath of the pandemic, I've noticed people want to talk longer. And especially like as a journalist, I'm like in the back of my mind, like I got a 2 p.m. deadline. I need to call someone else. What I always like to do too is kind of set parameters. So, you know, especially if I'm on a deadline, I really do try to be as transparent as possible in the beginning. Like, I really do only have 20 minutes, but I really want to take this time to ask you these questions. And I notice when someone's a little bit long-winded, I let them finish a little bit. Like, I span it for 2 or 3 minutes. And then I say, hey, if you were to say this in a minute or 30 seconds, what would you say? Because I know that 2-minute, I can't use that if they're very long-winded, or I have to paraphrase. So sometimes sometimes they need to like, what is that, word vomit a little bit, and then they can like say it a little bit more succinctly, a little bit more concise, and so I allow for that to happen. But there's times where like people are a little bit long-winded, but I think especially if you have a, like, I don't want to say deadline, or maybe can't spare an hour, 2 hours, right? Like that's very okay to be very transparent in the beginning and say, oh, or maybe in the middle of it when you see it running long, like, hey, I only have 5 more minutes, but you know, you mentioned this, this, and this. Can you just like maybe repeat yourself? And what would you say in 30 seconds? And so sometimes I try to like change the question, but ask the same question at the same time to see if it's a different response. Because sometimes I have these really great interviews, and like I interviewed a gentleman yesterday, and he was like, they just won't provide us the answers. And he kept saying answers, but I was like, okay, if I just use this quote, nobody would know what I'm talking about. So I was like, can you provide more in depth? Like, what are the answers that you're looking for? And then after like 10 minutes, he just said it perfectly in a minute. And it was like, okay. You know, so sometimes it's like asking the same questions, but if you went on, and sometimes I'm like, hey, can I get your contact information? I can't talk for very long now, but maybe I can give you a phone call when the time allows it. So it's like slightly getting out of it. I don't know if that makes sense. Any other questions? I saw some hands up in this side. Yes.
What's the most bizarre thing you've witnessed a politician say or do that wasn't captured on audio or video? If you feel comfortable.
Oh, no. It's more so like, it's not, I think what people don't understand sometimes in DC or on Capitol Hill, right? Because sometimes people are like, oh no, I cover politics, so I know covering Capitol Hill. And I'm like, no, those are 2 completely different things. Like, there's invisible rules. And maybe you're going to ask me, what is an invisible rule? If you are interviewing a lawmaker and they go on a subway, so that's an underground little subway that they go to different buildings, you cannot get on with them. Like, you cannot, that if you do, it almost like, they might actually like blacklist you and not talk to you. Or like there's an elevator, there's a known rule that you can follow them to the elevator, but you cannot get on the elevator with them.
I've always wondered that, why they don't go into the elevator with them.
It's these invisible rules that like I've seen new reporters and I'm like, whoa, it's like this one thing that's like, it's been established for so long that it's almost like if you do, a senator will like look at you and say, what are you doing? Like, you must be new here, right? And so I think one recently that I was just not even bizarre. There's also known on Capitol Hill that there's certain lawmakers that don't talk to you, but they're so friendly on TV. So like the best example is like Elizabeth Warren. I've seen her on TV and she is like, there's been so many lawmakers like that. Like, so personable, so engaging. I see them like shaking hands with like everyone. And it's only until recently when she like ran for like presidential election. But before that, it was known like you would go up to her and she's like, I do not talk like while I'm walking. And it's like, okay. And like there's a lot of people like that. And so, but recently though, she's now more approachable. But I remember there's like, I don't even know this lawmaker's name. I just remember going up to her. Oh yeah, it's Marsha Blackburn. Who am I talking about? And she's like, yeah, I don't do like interviews in the hallway. And I was just like, oh. And it's just like one of those things that they don't record when it's just like very much like, oh no, this is where I talk and this is where I don't talk. And I think there's just nothing, it's like you have to know that if you're on Capitol Hill, but you don't know. And there's just times too where like I've talked to a lawmaker on Capitol Hill. I just had this with like Chris Coons, who's a Democrat senator from Delaware, I believe. And I went up to him, like he was walking down the hallway. I stopped him to just say hello. And then he turns to me like, who are you? And I was like, oh, I'm like, Camila, I'm with the Washington Post. And I wanted to ask you about why you supported this bill. Like, it's because of Silicon Valley Bank. I don't know if anybody like read about the collapse. He supported a bill that kind of loosened those regulations. So I was like, I just want to know if you regret that. And it was so clear he was willing to do the interview. He heard the question and goes, good for you. And then just turns to go on. And then it was so bad because I was like, whoa. That was like, you turn to me, say you're willing to do the interview, and then you don't like the question, and then you turn. And it was so bad. I mean, like, it was just so rude that his communication person comes out and he was like, I apologize, I've heard that so much. Like, he's just going through personal things. And then I, like, told that to someone, and they're like, yeah, this is like, he does that a lot. So it's like also knowing, like, I'm like, yeah, it's just so funny, but if I had a big camera, like, there, you wouldn't say that. You know what I mean? Like, you're only saying this. And I was like, I really wish, like, that was the one time I really wish I recorded that. Just to, like, even have a segment, like, you know, like, interaction. No. I know. I don't know why I didn't do it.
Do you feel that it makes it more difficult to interview politics on Capitol Hill, certain demographics, being a woman?
I think definitely when I was starting out and I didn't know the invisible rules or the politics behind, and there was times too, like, because you have to imagine too on Capitol Hill, there are like 20 reporters. If you're like trying to interview one lawmaker, there's like 20 reporters coming on different sides trying to interview that same person. And so I think when I first started off, I was very timid, and like if people were shouting over me, I'd be like, okay, you got it, you know, like you have this question, it's fine. And then it's funny because I just ran into a newer reporter, and I was telling her, like, never feel bad for like raising your voice or asserting yourself a little bit more. Like, you have to do that in order to get your questions right. And it's like a very abnormal thing to do because you're just in this environment where like you're around people that are not working with you. Like, yes, they're reporters, but they're not working at your outlet. Like, they're not working with you on a story. So which is one of those things I think it's like, I can remember in the beginning, I was getting cut off a lot by like a lot of the male reporters, but I think at the time too, I was telling myself like, oh, I'll have my turn, but then noticing that the lawmaker would stop for 20 seconds and then go home. And then in that 20 seconds being like, why didn't I speak? Like, you know, so I think it's one of those things where you have to like assert. I think I'm way more assertive on Capitol Hill than I would be talking to anybody in another setting. I think it's just what it calls for. But yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of things sometimes where I notice where like, oh, I just noticed this like lawmaker giving more attention to like this male report, you know, but it's like, okay, now I just know I need to, you know, get a little bit more cut over, get in their face a little bit more to ask my questions.
When you're in those big groups, is it okay to use other people's questions for your story, or you should just use your questions?
Oh no, that's a great question. That's actually a really great question because I don't think a lot of people understand. If they say something and it's a group of reporters, what I usually say in my story is like, this senator told reporters on Thursday. But if it's like me individually, I catch in the hallway, no one else, then I can say he told the Washington Post because I know he individually told me and nobody else can get that. So yeah, in group settings, I think everything's fair game. And that's why sometimes you also see that there's a reporter, maybe you're working on an exclusive story, you don't want anybody to know, but you need that senator comment. I also see sometimes people waiting outside, like, right, like the big group is here, they're on the corners, and they're waiting for him to be by themselves for then to approach and ask that question. So sometimes when I'm working on really sensitive stories, I don't like to like ask my question in front of a big group of people unless I'm comfortable knowing that information can be shared on other platforms. But it's definitely fair game, definitely fair game.
You talk about raising your voice to get your voice heard, you know, as reporters. Can you speak more about, you know, other ways, basically the competitive nature of your job as a journalist, you know, to make sure, you know, your voice does get heard and you know, get the right connections with, you know, political people, stuff like that?
No, that's a really great question. I think a lot of people on Capitol Hill, it's almost this weird like ecosystem where if you really know like AOC, let's just take her for example, you will know, you know, where her office is located because that's public information. You might know maybe she loves to go to this certain coffee shop. So I think it's also like understanding who you need sometimes and then understanding where do they go. So if I know I'm searching for this lawmaker, but I know he always is in person at these committee hearings, I will then go to that committee hearing before it even begins, like 45 minutes before. And I will make sure I like go in the same doorway where he's coming. I know it gets a little extensive where you're like, how do you stand out? But like even George Santos, I knew about 20 or 30 reporters were standing out of his office. So if I'm trying to stand out, why would I stand where everybody else is standing, right? But I also know that because he's trying to like ignore press attention, he goes through certain like exits. And I was hearing about a really secret stairwell. And so it was just funny. I had an interview with another lawmaker, and something just told me, like, Camille, just stand. Like, just show up 20 minutes early and just stand by that staircase. And sure enough, I heard shouting. And who's the first person to walk down while all the reporters are like 5, 10 feet back? And I just stood there, took out my phone, and I was the first person there. And it was just funny because all those people were waiting for maybe 2-3 hours, but it was just like, no, let me just stay in there. And then I was able to ask him this question, which then made it on Jimmy Kimmel, and that was kind of embarrassing because people saw me sprint. Like, I mean, full-on sprint. Like, it wasn't a fast walk. It was like a full-on sprint. And someone was like, I just saw your hair flip. And I was like, yeah, I'm so sorry. So I think sometimes, like, when you're talking about competition, and I'm only talking about Capitol Hill, but it's like predicting, if you want to find a particular person, predicting where they would go. Maybe it's looking at their schedule. Maybe it's looking about if there's a committee hearing happening, who's supposed to be on that committee. Is that the person that you need? A lot of times it's almost like, even knowing if there's votes happening, what exits do they use? Like there's, like, you know, like people, we're creatures of habit. So like if you only exit this, like I know if I'm looking for like Ayanna Pressley or someone, I know what exit she goes out of. I know I can find her there. So I think sometimes predicting it before, then also anticipating maybe what your story is and what you need, and then kind of placing yourself so then maybe you can get the answers before everybody else. But it is like in an environment where it's like there's a lot of reporters, so if you're not asking the question, maybe someone else is, and you don't, like you were saying about the, you know, he told a group of reporters, someone asked a really great question, I end up using that for my story rather than the question I asked myself, and that's completely okay because he told a group of people. Mm-hmm.
Post January 6th, what ways did the Capitol set boundaries post January 6th that affected you as a journalist?
Yeah, that's a really great question because they became very strict about that. So I have a badge. I actually have like 2 badges, and one of the things we were able to go in certain areas. You know, like I think more transparency near where they actually vote. But now it's like I can't even wear a certain like big jacket. I can't bring a bag. So I think sometimes, especially if I know I'm going to be sitting outside for lawmakers, I know I can't go back. Like I used to just be able to go back inside. Now I have to like go through security, and I'm like dropping off 2 phones and like my microphones and everything like that. So it's made it a little bit harder to function going in and out. But I think that's just security purposes. And a lot of times, like I get stopped so many and being like, here's my badge, you know, like they need to look at the expiration date. What color is it? All those things like that. So they're a little bit more like wary, I think, of anything, especially like the State of the Union address. I had to show up there like 4 hours early, which before I used to show up 30 minutes and just sit down, and now it's like absolutely not. You need to be in a designated area. So a lot of times it just means more preparation, if that makes sense. Like if I know I have to do something, it's even thinking in advance where I'm going to stand. Can I even have a coat out? Like sometimes I'm outside and I'm like, all right, I can't wear a jacket because I need to go in and out. So I think it's just like the preparation stance of it has become a little bit more complicated to navigate, because you don't know what procedures they're going to take. Like for the State of Union, they brought in the SWAT team. Like there was so many, like a lot of like people from the Army. There was like even this like chamber that they were just standing there. Like it was just, like I've never seen it as intense as it was during the State of the Union. So it's one of those things that I think they're taking a lot of precaution with. But just as a reporter, it's just knowing what you can and can't do and trying to like work your way around it. But it's never hindered my reporting. It's just more like I had to just think in advance what I was going to do. Actually, it's funny. I was supposed to be there, and then I got caught. My movers came a day early, and so I was like, guys, I got to call. I have to move. And then I remember getting all these calls and them saying like, hey, like, are you there? And I was like, oh no, I had to move today. And then everybody was just like, well, and I was actually going to go to Capitol Hill because I had a friend up there that couldn't get like no Uber, nothing, no taxis were even going to remotely ride there. So, and that's the thing now too. It's like a lot of times you'll see fences, you'll see extra security now. They'll look at your badge like 4 times just to make sure. I still haven't brought a visitor just because I'm not really even sure of the protocols now. Before it was a little bit more lax, now they're a little bit more on guard.
How would you say that Pulitzer Fellowship and your experience with the Sunshine Award, how have they impacted your professional career since then?
I do think what's great about the Pulitzer Center is a lot of times you're pitching your ideas and you might not know where it lands, or, you know, especially different news outlets, they're going to like want the story already fleshed out. And what I really felt like the Pulitzer Center did that was better than anybody else is that they gave you a team of editors and people to work with. So it's like while you're on the ground, you're reporting your story, you also have a team of editors. You also have, you know, people looking at your stories, interviews. And so I think them giving a better, well-rounded like advice and like advising through the whole writing process, I think just gave me a better understanding what it'd be like to pursue different careers, whether it's in like video and writing. And because I already had that portfolio because of the Pulitzer Center, because I was able to write 4 stories and do a video element, it just made my candidacy for like applying to other jobs just more stronger. Like, you know, with them allowing you to go somewhere, they also give you the grant money. So the funding really does help. And even when I was at CQ Roll Call and they simply said like, hey, you have these great stories to tell at the southern border, but we simply just do not have the money to come, like to actually like fund it. I called the Pulitzer Center and was like, hey, so I have these stories already ready. You know, you already know my work product because I've worked with you in the past. And they were just like, of course, how much? You know, and they were just as simple as writing another grant. So I worked with the Pulitzer Center actually 2 times. But the second time was just through my company. But it was just simply like, it was CQ Roll Call. It's a really well-known DC publication. It just, at the time, did not have the resources to send me to Southern Border. And I ended up doing way more stories there than I thought possible just because the funding is important. You know, especially just everything that we needed for that trip.
That's a great segue. I'd like to hand this out. And,
Oh, yes.
This is just
Shameless plug.
informational sheet about the Pulitzer Center Student Fellowship. Information about it, try to promote it as much as we can. The deadline is April 10th. You don't have to be a journalism major to be able to be selected. The whole idea is to give. We encourage everybody to apply for it. As you were saying, it's really useful. There's mentorship. You have a lot of support, right? So even if you're not fully versed in being a reporter,
Right.
you've got a lot of help getting you going.
100%. Like I think my second reporting trip ever, like going parachuting, going on the ground, it was with CQ Roll Call, but I wouldn't have been as prepared. Oh yes. Not right now. It's fine. I know. I tell you, I do it for a living. It's fine. But I would say that I wouldn't have felt as confident going on the ground, telling the stories, interviewing people on the fly if it wasn't for my first time experience with the Pulitzer Center. And it's really great too, because then after they give you like a whole consortium of like alum. And so maybe I'm not interested in doing politics anymore, but because another Pulitzer like Center alum is now a business reporter, then I can connect with them. So it kind of like you have another area of like networking. And if you don't know this by now with journalism, it's a lot about networking, meeting people in different outlets, industries, and things like that. So it's actually like really great just to kind of tap in whenever I need to.
Right. Yeah, this QR code will take you through the information session that we had. It'll tell you even more about it, and we hope to see everybody apply if they're interested at all. It's a great experience. Looks great on your resume. It really helps distinguish you no matter what you do. One of the things I tell our students is that journalism teaches you things that are going to help you no matter what you do, right? No matter what field you end up in, journalistic tools are going to come in handy. Being curious, being accurate, being fair. These are things that apply across the board, right?
Oh, 100%. Being detail-oriented, I mean, I don't know. Even my friends are accountants. I'm like, oh, wait, like, I see something there, but it's only because it's like you have to pay attention to the detail. Even talking to people, like, because I do it for a living, that can apply to, like, any industry, right? It's just the skills, the tools that you kind of learn, whether you're, like, editing, whether you're talking to people, interviewing, fact-checking, writing, it's applicable to any major, any like business. I have friends in all different industries and we're all like, wait, these are the similarities. Like knowing even how to like present yourself and like, you know, like work on even your social media and things like that. It's like, it's applicable to anything that you really want to do.
Oh, I forgot to mention, on the back of this is a code that you can do a survey for the Pulitzer Center. They would love it to hear what you think about this event, what you think about them in general. So please do that as well. That would be a big favor for me. Any other questions?
Did you ever consider leaving journalism and why?
That's a great question. Wow, it's like, sounds so cliche if I'm like, no, I just didn't. And the only thing is that I've been able, I think what's really great is, and I think this with any career anybody wants to pursue, is like knowing people in the industry, right? Like when I first started off, I used to get coffees with like anybody that like I was working with. And then also in like the New York Times, like places that I wanted to work at the time, the Washington Post, like any other organization. And I think a lot of that was because I was so new where I just didn't understand anything that could happen. Like, right, like newsroom politics, maybe understanding the challenges in whatever I wanted to cover. And so the best thing I had were like mentors to be like, oh, watch out for this. Wait, this seems like a bad decision. Or, hey, you might want to think about this a little bit more. And so I think because I've had people to navigate, I've like avoided a lot of pitfalls that maybe people feel accustomed to. Also having the conversations about like mental health and like taking breaks and like using vacations. I was at this one outlet where we almost prided ourselves for not taking vacation. I remember one time being like, I worked 18 days straight and feeling really proud about that. And then being like, because there was just always breaking news on the weekends, so I was just working straight through. And then now, I mean, if I work, you know, like it's always like, oh wait, actually I need a comp day here, or I worked the whole weekend, so I'm going to need 3 days. So I think learning, maybe what's helped is because I've learned how to advocate for myself and also taking breaks when I needed to. I think every journalist almost experiences burnout a little bit, no matter what capacity, just overworking yourself, because journalism is not a straight like 9 to 5. Sometimes I'm working really late, sometimes I'm working really early, just depending. Like when I really do say, I will have to go back to my high school teacher and be like, you were right, like every day is completely different. And I just don't know what other career where I would have to wake up and be like, what am I doing today? Like every day, I mean, it really is very different. I have to keep a calendar, a notepad, just to kind of like write out what I'm doing every day, just to kind of keep a little sane. So I think it's exciting. I mean, there's just definitely times where I'm like, oh, I want a vacation for 2 weeks or 3 weeks just to decompress. But I think the fact I was just telling him I went to Ohio, to do a profile on a senator, but it ended up me learning about like trains. And I thought that was something where I was like, I'm not really well versed in, but now if you ask me anything about it, now I can tell you. And that was only in 2 or 3 days. So I talked to so many people from different areas, and now I have a better grasp of the issue at hand. So I think it's just like one of those careers that just keeps on giving it away. I don't know.
Right, talking about the 24-hour news cycle, it's such a relatively new development that it's really just revamped the entire profession. We didn't used to do this. People had time to reflect and compile and that, but now it's the name of the game is to get it fast and first.
Yeah.
And it never stops. And there's so many mouths to feed, right? It's very great. So I'm glad you took time for yourself. What other questions might you have?
Oh, I'll get to. Oh wait, and I also just want to say this other thing too. Journalism so much can branch out to other things. I will say that. Like, I have so many colleagues I know that are writing books because they just felt like that 2,000 word article was just not enough to like cover. So I know a lot of people that like ended up going teaching or doing HBO series, right? Like, I think it just spans of like, you don't just have to just write, depending whatever medium. Like, it just really does span to like working on like video sets or doing these like or working on a whole investigative podcast. So I think it's just because from what I'm doing, I could span off and doing so many things. I just never think about it as just being a journalist. I think it's like being a storyteller maybe, and just finding what platform do I want to tell my stories and who can connect me with that. And because I'm at the Washington Post, they have so many different platforms where it's like, okay, maybe I want to write a book. Maybe I want to do something else. I'm sorry, there's 3. And then that's it, course, right? You just said lunch, sorry. I don't want to curate this.
You don't want to choose?
Hmm?
You don't want to what?
I don't want to curate, I know, are we on time? Can I take 3 more questions?
Oh, please, of course, absolutely.
Okay, and then.
How is current political punditry and sensationalism jeopardize the integrity of news organizations? And can you give us the names of some of the most egregious offenders?
You want all the details. No, I think, there's definitely, sometimes too, when we're talking about stories or we're talking about Capitol Hill, and we're like, okay, we want to cover this angle, but who do we know are already going to say the things that we already know that they're going to say, right? Or they're going to be very extreme, or maybe they're going to try to deny things. So a lot of times, the conversation I really do have with my colleagues is like, who are the people that are like, kind of like, up in the air that we actually don't know what they're going to say, right? So I think a lot of times maybe people want to see the black and white, but it's really kind of showing the complexities of issues. Maybe people that voted on a bill and originally sincerely did believe that they were doing the best thing, and then now, 5 years later, do they even regret it? And then kind of understanding that. So I think a lot of times, if we already know certain people are going to say things that we already know they're going to say, whether they're going to be very extreme, maybe very more conservative, maybe more liberal, we try to just show other voices, maybe people that are a little bit more moderate, maybe people who are really working on this issue that have a firsthand knowledge of it. So I think there's a tendency that we want to, give the boldest quote, but I think those are maybe time when we lose people a little bit. So it's really kind of showcasing maybe the people in the in-between. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just really trying to show a whole grasp of there's not just, everybody talks about Marjorie Taylor Greene, but a lot of people just don't understand her relevance on certain committees is very, very minimal. You know what I mean? Same as AOC, everybody knows her in papers, but if you're on Capitol Hill, her standing on committees, which is actually kind of important, is not as she has no leadership position. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's like sometimes people think that the people in the news are the ones that are the decision making, that are really behind certain like decisions, when they don't understand that the people that were really moderate, they're the ones actually behind the decisions. So just trying to showcase that a little bit more is like one of our goals. Hopefully that answers.
You spoke on how journalism relates to other fields. You talked about, defense and accounting. While staying in the realm of writing, because I like write songs and stuff like that, and everybody listens to music. When you listen to a good song or a song that sticks in your head, when it comes to the writing, what are some things that you appreciate in a hit song as a journalist?
Yeah, I think ones for me, like I think the beat behind it always has, because actually the funny thing is, I just was learning this when I was developing a podcast with the Washington Post, is like a lot of times we use music for our stories, like especially if you listen to a good podcast and you like the vocals or even the instrumentals they use. And so for me always it's like when they have a really good message, maybe it's like the beat and the message of it intertwining. And you always hear something. I think no matter what form it comes in, whether it's a song, whether it's through writing something, or whether through it's an article, it's like when something's very powerful, right? Like, like that moment where you get like goosebumps. And I think that can be interchangeable no matter what form it is. So even as a journalist where I write for a living, I can always appreciate when I hear like an artist, no matter what kind of music it is, and if it has a really great message or it's something that gives me goosebumps, it's like how I feel about when I hear a good quote. It's like, oh, that's it. And so I think it's like when you talk about like how it's transferable, it's like even knowing how to write, like there's like a certain like rhythm too, when like a tone when you're writing, and being very cognizant of that. It's like almost like I know if I can write a press release or an article or a feature, like whatever form, it's just knowing maybe your audience and knowing how to tune it to like where it fits just right. So maybe it's like that quote you use, maybe it's that word choice. Like there's so many times where I'm like, illustrate is not the word I want to use, right? Like how do I change this to make it a little bit more powerful? Like how can I tweak this? So it's like knowing the words, it's knowing, the audience, and then how to put it together to like kind of create a piece where it like hits people and you're like, oh wow, like this is it. It's almost like writing a song though, because there's like so many parts to it that when you like put it together and you're like, oh, I like the sound of this. I really like how this came out. Like this is my product. It's like this is what I created. Mm-hmm.
Are there certain topics that you will absolutely refuse to cover?
It's so funny. I just got asked this like 3 times in the last week, and no, seriously, when I was like in Ohio, someone just randomly asked me that, and I said that there's very few topics I wouldn't cover. I think ones that I found very, very like explosive, or I don't even want to say politically divisive. I just think like I've covered everything, like right on the border, on the Rio Grande, like literally migrants trying to cross unlawfully into the U.S. Like I've covered that. I've covered things on Capitol Hill, and I covered White House. I covered protest, and I think just the one subject where I'm like, whew, this just did not prepare you for is covering topics related to abortion. I think, that's just where I've had so many conversations with people that feel very passionately about it, and there's like a lot of religious aspects of it, and I don't say I wouldn't cover it. I think I just have friends who do cover it, and I'm like, wow, I stepped into your shoes for a day, and I'm going to leave that to you, because I think it's just one of those conversations where when there's like a lot of religious beliefs behind it, it's almost one of those where it's like people feel very right in their opinion. And, especially the protest after the Roe v. Wade, I was there that day, and I was in front of Capitol Hill, and I was actually in front of the Supreme Court, and I think just seeing the masses of people and like the screaming, shouting, and like almost physical fights, I was just like I don't think there's any topic that you can compare this to where you would get this people like crying, like, just visceral like reactions to it, where I was just like, wow. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
We're going to have a little, oh, go ahead.
Okay, do you feel like there are unspoken beauty standards imposed upon reporters within visual mediums of journalism?
I think there is. I think I remember when I first started, I don't know if this is like answering your question, this was like 7-8 years ago, and I was first asked to go on CNN or MSNBC, one of them. And I usually always wear my hair natural. And someone was like, you need to straighten it. Like, you really need to straighten it. Like, book an appointment today. And I just was like, no, I don't want to do that. And they were like, the whole thought process was like, if you do not do this, they're never going to book you. And I think I remember at the time, I was like 20 or something, and I was just like, well, if they don't want to book me with my natural hair, then I guess I just won't go on TV. Like, it's fine. And I think I've just kind of stayed with this. And I've seen, honestly, throughout the years, it kind of evolve and having more conversations around, like, Black women, women of color, and them having their natural hair. And that's just like one topic where I just feel like there's still a lot of stigmas within the news industry. I remember like working for Univision at one time. That was like my second internship. And I remember a lot of comments about my hair at the time, like, hey, do you want to straighten it? And I remember it was like 90-degree weather, and I was like, it won't stay straight. Like, it'll like last for 30 seconds. So I think there's been a little bit more of open conversations about that. And I've honestly, since then, I've never, and that wasn't even someone at like the network level. It was just someone that was, I think, genuinely trying to give me advice. But I think there, just in terms of beauty standards, I think just like with any industry there are. I think this one is just way more where people are trying to push the boundaries and like push the limits and push the barriers and just say, hey, no, this is like who I am, and we need more representation on TV as well as off camera. I think like media representation, honestly, like people of color being in like the media, like that's a lot of representation. There's so many times I go to events and I'm like, oh, there's like no one of color here. Or, you know, why aren't there more, especially about this topic? So even in politics, like there are very few. So I think it's just something that it's still like having open and honest conversations about, and still showing up and saying, hey, we need more people of color to kind of cover these things and be a journalist and report about these. So it's just more representation on that aspect. Yes.
Do you think that in this career, since you're working with so many other people's opinions, that you kind of have to like force yourself to lose your own?
That's a good question. It's funny because I think a lot of people who know me will say, I've always been like this, though. I've always been a devil's advocate kind of person. So, like, you tell me an opinion, I'll be like, but, like, so-and-so said this. And, like, you know, kind of play it off of it. And I think, not to say I've never had an opinion, it's just more so I've always been curious about what other people's are and what makes them tick. And so a lot of times, too, like, I mean, in my reporting or even when I'm interviewing people, people will always turn to me and be like, no, tell me, what do you think? Or like, what should I be thinking? And like, that's always where I try to stay clear. I was like, no, like I'm really just trying to understand what you're saying. Or, you know, hey, I heard you were so-and-so, like you were just in Oregon. What did you think about this? And so I think just at times, because I'm trying to allow people to give the space to voice their own, I don't feel comfortable presenting my own, if that makes sense. Right? Like if I only have 20 minutes and I really want to make sure I'm understanding how they think, why they think this way, what do they care about? It's sometimes like, it's more so like, hey, I don't want to take up space. I want to give you this space because it's, you know, just so you can kind of voice your opinions. So a lot of times though, there is this like thought that like you can't share it, or maybe there's something that you're really passionate about, but you have to kind of like tone down from it. So I just think that a lot of how I just kind of view things is like, hey, in this space when I'm really just trying to like sit down and really trying to understand like, why do you think the way you think? It's like me asking you the questions. I get really uncomfortable if people are asking me the questions and being like, what? Like what's happening? But yeah, I think it's learning to navigate and knowing how to voice yours and when it's appropriate to do so. Yeah.
We're going to have a lovely little meet and greet and have lunch later before she gets back on the road, so you'll have plenty more time to chat with her if you like. But would you wrap up just by telling us what's your favorite thing about being a working modern journalist, and what's your least favorite thing about being a working modern journalist?
I will say this. When you're on Capitol Hill so much like I am, you get so used to like talking to a politician and them giving you a very straightforward or very like political answer to things, right? Like it's very clean cut, it's very polished. And I think I always love, like seriously, one of my favorite things is going on the ground and talking to people because it's like so far removed from that. It's like very uncut. Like I will never forget one of my first ever reporting trips was like in Texas, and I was talking about this one issue, and just people were just so unapologetically themselves, like very like unfiltered, and be like, no, I'm gonna say whatever comes to my mind. And I think a lot of times that when you're on Capitol Hill, it's sometimes a bubble. So one of my favorite things is like actually really talking to people and like really understanding, going to the ground, traveling, and hearing what people have to say. My least favorite, people say this all the time, but sometimes it's the editing process a little bit because it's like, you know, it's something you worked on for like a week and you're like, every quote is great. And then you're like, you have to cut it. And then you get like a little bit sad and you're like, does it really need to go out? But then you see the final product and I'm always happy with it. I'm always like, this was a good decision to do this. So it's just editing something sometimes and getting critique. Not the best. Necessary.
Any last questions before we partake of the meal we have?
Any preguntas?
Anything you want to add?
No, I think that's all. I'll stay behind. So if there's any more like questions or anything like that.
And we can find you just by you're everywhere. So we can just find you on TikTok. We can find you at Washington Post. We can find you on Instagram, I suppose, and all those
Yeah, all those platforms. So if you're on them, follow me, please.